Chapter 13, The Electronic Signal. Beep, 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 beep. A message was flashing on Roz's computer. The drone was reporting that gusty winds had sent it spiraling into the neighbor's bean field. So the robot grabbed the big, heavy toolbox and marched out to clean up the mess. Roz found the flying machine upside down with its landing gear poking above the rows of leafy plants. It had some scrapes and scratches, but no major damage. She flipped it over, brushed it off, and tightened a few screws. Then she said, "Return to Hilltop Farm." The engines started buzzing, and the machine lifted off the ground and flew home. As Roz marched back, she cut through a strip of forest that separated the two farms. There were trees and ferns and rocks and shrubs and small forest animals. It was a little piece of wilderness. And suddenly the robot was thinking of that wild island she missed so much. Someday she would try to run away and return to her true home. Was this the moment for her escape? Could it be as easy as sneaking off through these trees? No, it couldn't be that easy. Ahead, on the other side of the trees, Mr. Sharif was sitting in his pickup truck watching Roz. Because of the robot's electronic signal, he knew she had stepped off the property, and he had raced out to see what she was up to. Roz marched over to the truck, and Mr. Sharif leaned out his window. He had a serious expression on his face. "Don't ever leave the property without my permission. Understand?" "I understand," said Roz. She understood all right. She understood that she was always being watched. She understood that she was trapped on Hilltop Farm. Chapter 14, The Sad Truth. That night, while everyone else was sleeping, Roz stayed up with her computer and researched sneaky subjects. She looked for diagrams of her own body, and for maps of the area, and for any news that might help her escape, but the robot found nothing. The computer only let her access information about farming. She was cut off from the outside world. It was clear that if Roz wanted to escape from her new life, she would need help. But the cows didn't know how to escape, and Mr. Sharif would never let his robot leave. Who would possibly help Roz run away from the farm? Chapter 15, The Children. As time rolled by, Roz saw less and less of Mr. Sharif, but she saw more and more of the children. They were shy at first. The robot might look up from the pasture and see Jad peeking around the corner of the barn, or see Jaya spying from the branches of a tree. But the children were growing bolder, and then one day, Roz marched into the workshop and heard giggling. She walked to the closet in the back, opened the door, and there was Jaya, smiling and trying not to laugh. "I'm hiding from my brother," whispered the girl. "Close the door." The robot closed the door. A minute later, Jad ran in, flushed and out of breath. "Hey, Roz, have you seen Jaya?" The robot just stared. "I know she's in here," said Jad, and he began prowling around the room. He searched under the work table and behind the tool chest and between all the bulky workshop machines. Finally, he marched up to Roz and said, "I order you to show me where my sister is hiding." The robot pointed to the closet. Jad smiled mischievously and tiptoed over. Then he flung the door open and screamed, "Found you!" "No fair," Jaya whined. "Roz showed you where I was hiding." The girl scowled at the robot. "That wasn't very nice, Roz, but you can make it up to me by playing hide and seek. Count to 100 and then try to find my brother and me, okay?" There was a brief pause. Then the robot said, "Okay." Jaya and Jad squealed with delight and scampered out the door as Roz started counting. The robot's sensitive ears listened carefully to the children outside. She heard quick footsteps crunching across the driveway. She heard a giggle and the sounds of tree branches shaking. She heard a grunt and the sounds of hay bales being shoved aside. When the robot finished counting, it took her exactly 5 seconds to find Jaya up in a tree. It took her another 8 seconds to find Jad in the hayloft. "Wow, Roz is really good at seeking," said Jad as he picked hay from his hair. Jaya snorted. "Yeah, well, let's just see how good she is at hiding." Roz was even better at hiding. While the children counted, the robot silently slipped away, and an hour later they still hadn't found her. The siblings stood in the driveway, defeated. "We give up, Roz," shouted Jad. "You win," shouted Jaya. The junk pile beside the barn started moving, and Roz appeared. The robot had been sitting there all along, perfectly camouflaged among the scrap metal and old farm machines. "The next time we play, you have to let one of us win," said Jaya to Roz. And the next time they played, Roz did. The robot enjoyed having the children around. They brought a little brightness into her world, and she hoped to bring a little brightness and lightness into theirs. Life must have been dark since their mother passed away. However, Roz had another reason for wanting the children around. She needed them. Her only chance of ever returning home was if Jaya and Jad could find it in their hearts to help her escape. But this was a delicate situation. If Roz tried too hard, the children might say something to their father. If she didn't try hard enough, she might be stuck on that farm forever. Chapter 16, The Robot's Dream. Cows grazed in the pasture. Wind rustled through the tall grass. Clouds drifted over the fields. Farm machines rumbled and buzzed. Milk flowed into bottles. Bottles were packed into boxes. Boxes were loaded onto the milk truck. The truck drove away full and returned empty. Children romped around with their dog. A man sat at his desk. A robot dreamed of escape. Chapter 17, The Birds. Hilltop Farm was home to many birds. Swallows were always swooping low over the grass and picking off insects. Crows called from the fields like a gang of hecklers. At night, owls glided above the countryside, silently searching for free little meals. The robot was stuck on that farm, but the birds were free to go wherever they pleased. Lucky birds. One day, Roz was standing in the pasture, admiring a hawk as he soared through the sky. When the cows began grazing around her, their slow footsteps crunched in the grass. Their teeth chewed and chewed, their tails flicked at flies. All the while, Roz stood there staring up at the hawk. And then came Lily's soft voice. "What are you thinking about, Roz?" The robot turned to the calf. "I'm thinking about Brightville," she said. "It was not so long ago that I was watching my son soar through the sky. That seems like another lifetime." "You must hate your new life," said Annabelle. "I can't say that I blame you. Farming looks like such grueling work." "Actually, I like farming," said Roz. "Somehow it feels right to spend long hours working with machines and tools and crops and animals, but I miss my old life on the island." Tess had a mouthful of dandelions, but that didn't stop her from speaking. "Maybe you should start thinking of this farm as your home. That island is awfully far away. There's a good chance you'll never make it back there." "Don't say that," cried Lily. "Roz just has to make it home. She needs to be with Brightville and her friends." "Tess is right," said Roz. "I may never make it home. If I were a bird, like my son, I could fly home all on my own any time I wanted. But I'm only a robot." Nobody spoke after that. The cows went back to grazing, and Roz went back to admiring the hawk. Her eyes followed the bird as he soared through the sky, free to go wherever he pleased. Chapter 18, The Entertaining Robot. The children wandered out behind the farm buildings, through a clearing, and over to an old oak tree. It was the same tree their father had climbed when he was a boy. Mr. Sharif's initials were carved into the bark at the bottom of a long list of initials. For generations, all the Sharifs had carved their initials into that tree, going back to the ancestors who first built the farm. Someday, the children would add their initials to the list. Beneath the leafy branches was a scattering of acorns. Jad cleared a spot for himself, sat down, and pulled a small computer from his pocket, while Jaya climbed above. The siblings spent the afternoon there, lazing around the tree until the robot marched past, carrying the big, heavy toolbox. "What you doing, Roz?" called Jad. The robot stopped. "The drone has crash-landed again," she said. "I'm going to fix it. Again." "Do you need any help?" "I do not need any help." "I'm bored," said Jaya, her legs dangling above her brother's head. Can you do something fun, Roz? The robot put down her toolbox and said, What would you like me to do? I don't know, said Jaya, thinking hard. Can you do a backflip? Yes, I can do a backflip. A grin spread across the girl's face. Roz, I order you to do a backflip. At that, Roz crouched, and then she leaped into the air, flipped backward, and gently landed on her feet. A perfect backflip. Jad put his computer away. Jaya jumped down from her branch. The children were impressed. What else can you do? Said Jad. Can you juggle? Yes, I can juggle. I order you to juggle some of these acorns. Roz walked up to the tree, picked 3 large acorns from the ground, and began juggling them in perfect rhythm. Jaya studied the robot's movements and then began tossing acorns into the air as well. The first one went a little too high. The next one went a little too far. And soon they all went tumbling back into the grass. Do you know any jokes? Said Jad. Why did the chicken cross the road? Never mind. Jad scratched his head. Can you tell us a story? What kind of story would you like to hear? A robot story, said Jad. An animal story, said Jaya. How about a robot and animal story, said Roz. The children smiled at each other. Then they sat against the tree and looked up at their robotic storyteller. Once upon a time there was a robot who lived alone on an island, Roz began. She spent her time wandering across mountains and forests and meadows, and then something terrible happened. Rocks fell and the robot tumbled off a cliff. She survived the fall, but sadly the rocks killed 2 geese and smashed 4 of their eggs. The robot stood there staring at the poor goose family until she heard a tiny voice peeping from somewhere nearby. She followed the peeping voice and discovered a perfect goose egg sunk in the dirt. The robot carefully picked up the egg and carried it away. And when the gosling hatched from his shell, the first thing he saw was the robot looking back. Mama! Mama! He peeped. The gosling thought the robot was his mother, and from that day on, she was. The robot adopted the gosling as her son, and together they made a funny, little, happy family. The end. The children sat there and thought about Roz's strange story. Then they looked up at her and said, What happened next? Chapter 19, The Storytellers. Roz and the children had a new routine. Several times a week they'd gather beneath the oak tree and Roz would tell stories about the robot on the island. The children loved hearing how the robot survived mudslides and bear attacks and harsh winter weather. They loved hearing how she befriended the island animals, but the stories they loved most were about the robot and her son, the goose. He sounded like such a nice goose. Roz told the children story after story after story. What she didn't tell them, what she couldn't tell them, was that the stories were true and they were about her. The children wanted to get in on the storytelling fun. Jaya told adventure stories about dragons and monsters. Jad told silly stories about aliens in outer space. But as the children grew more comfortable with Roz, they began talking about their own lives. They talked about growing up way out in the country. They talked about their schoolmates and their friends and their family. They talked about how their parents used to work together around the farm and how perfect everything was before the accident. In an instant, their lives were upended. Their mother was gone and their father was injured. Mr. Sharif tried to keep the farm going by himself, but there was so much to do and he was so weak now. The farm machines powered along, doing their jobs as usual, but they needed to be maintained and monitored. Eventually, the machines started breaking down, and the farm started falling to pieces. The children wondered if life would ever feel normal again. That's why we got you, Roz, said the girl. We needed you to save this place. And that's exactly what you're doing, said the boy with a smile.